Is going on, everybody? Welcome to Logical, Plausible, Probable. Gonna do some crazy stuff tonight. Myself and one and only CJ Cox, also known as the Synagogue. We're going to be discussing, is Trump good for conservatism? So for all of you who are used to on my stream usually being much more about different topics, let's just say, this should be a fun one, and it's actually one of my my personal side passions. Professionally, I've actually done some stuff in politics, and so these kind of conversations are always fun to have. And for those of you who think that somehow CJ is actually some hardcore leftist progressive, he is actually not. So this might actually have some interesting dialogue between the two of us, because we'll actually be discussing things from hopefully an intellectual level and not just spewing a bunch of random talking points like the usual conversations we hear about politics on YouTube, CNN, MSNBC, and all of the others in between. So CJ, thanks so much for having this great idea earlier and being willing to do it on the fly. Go ahead and tell us about yourself. Let the audience know who you are. Shout out your channel, and what kind of sparked your interest in having this debate. Actually, I think would be interesting to kind of get things kicked off.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and thank you very much for having me here on the channel. And obviously, pretty short notice for you as well. So thanks for that. So I run the Synagogue YouTube channel. To give you guys a brief background there. Basically, all we do there is just talk about Christian apologetics on my Unapologetics podcasts or show or whatever you call these things that we do on YouTube. And then also I have the Watchdog, which discusses politics and news and stuff like that. So in the future, I plan to have some history videos and some philosophy videos and stuff like that. I kind of need to wait until I have more time for that kind of stuff, but nonetheless, so that's basically what I have going on there. If anybody wants to check it out, that is again the Synagogue. Nonetheless, my interest in this particular debate, so I consider myself to be somewhat of an ideological purist when it comes to what would you call this? I guess conservatism, constitutionalism is really the word I guess I like to use more. And there's very few politicians, I'll be honest, who pass my personal threshold of truly conservative. Trump less so than others because of, I think, a couple of missing big city Democrat things that carry over with him that didn't necessarily carry over with others, and I'll obviously get into more detail with that. And I also think that while it's certainly a overplayed thing and overplayed in relatively stupid ways, if we're being completely frank, because most people who talk about Trump's personality don't actually have substance. I do think Trump's personality is problematic for other reasons. I won't spoil my argument, so I'll let you know what those are. But to make a long story short, I think it makes certain things that conservatives used to do very well very difficult. So it's one of those things where it's like I would like to see a return to old-fashioned constitutionalism, Ron Paulian kind of conservatism in the Republican Party. And to be frank, I am a little bit of a cynic on this as well. And to just kind of let the audience know, I don't present actually another option in this particular debate, right? I'm not saying go vote for Biden because that would be a stupid idea. Right. And none of the third-party candidates in this particular cycle are worth anything at all, nor could they win. I am somewhat cynical in the sense that I think that there was a bed made in 2016 and we're in this for the long haul as a result. So I'm not here to convince anybody not to vote for Donald Trump or anything like that. I just think that basically it was sort of a net negative for the conservative movement, and I aim to explain, of course, why.
Well, I look forward to this. This should be a fun conversation. So for anybody who has not already subbed to CJ's channel, I just put the link in the description. So if you want to go check him out, go over there and make sure you get subbed and get ready for some fun. And I tell you what, folks, I'm looking forward to this because just from those brief words shared by CJ, he is embodying part of what I'm going to be addressing in my opening statement. So this should be this should be fun. So man, if you're ready to rock and roll, I know I'm taking the affirmative. So I guess I will go ahead and go first. Those of you who this is like the first real live debate I've done on my channel, so we're going to kind of follow the MDD rules. And since CJ is not a liberal, I don't think we really need a mod. We can actually have general conversation. So we're going to do opening statements, probably 10 to 12 minutes. I have no idea how long mine is going to be. It's not going to be that long because I wrote it very rapidly, and it's not that long. So kick that off. Then we'll go into open discussion, and then if anybody wants to ask questions towards the end, we can do some of that. But just kind of wait to post them until we say we're getting close to that. I'll make a reference to that because I actually kind of need to be able to look at them in the live chat. So hold on to your questions until the end, and yeah, should be a good time. So I guess without further ado, let's rock and roll and do this.
Sure. Just so you know, I'll have my camera off for your opening statement.
Okay. All right. Actually, let me get a timer going so I know how long I'm running my mouth. All right. Here we go. All right. So tonight, as we discuss the concept of is Trump good for conservatism, I want all of you watching this live or in the future to remember one very important fact. And this is whether you like Trump personally or not, and his personality and all that comes with that. That should have zero bearing on his being a positive or negative from the macro view of conservatism. For to dismiss the actions of a leader under the influence of your feelings rather than through logical analysis makes you nothing but a political pawn who can be swayed and to help perpetuate the corruption that plagues us all right now. I'm not suggesting this is the CJ's position. I'm talking about from a macro view and more of a direct jab at the rhinos and the never Trumpers. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to blame the inaction of those who have called themselves conservatives while being spineless, holier than thou hypocrites, which led to a personality like Trump being a necessity rather than optimal in terms of the quote-unquote traditional statesmanship that was needed in order to save the republic. But that said, what is Trump? He is portrayed by the media as this horribly crass individual, mocked by the pundits and railed against by all the rhinos and the never Trumpers. However, I would argue the only reason his style is viewed as so objectionable is that for the last 30 years, we've had nothing but flowery speeches from corrupt cowards who are, as Trump says, all talk and no action. Well, they have taken action, but only to enrich themselves at our expense, seize our liberties, and make conscious efforts to destroy the American dream. I think that is on full display with what's going on right now with the unveiling of the Joe and Hunter Biden scandal and all of the different underlying threads that connect to all over DC and literally the globe on a political level. But now for the topic at hand, and is Trump good for conservatism? I would argue that he is. In 2015, we stood on the edge of an abyss as a civilization. We had a bunch of politicians with no guts and willingness to rise up and say, this far, no farther, the line is here. We shall not go quietly into socialism and tyranny. No, we had a bunch of cowards who claimed to be conservatives, but for decades had done nothing. Not only have they failed to counter the daily onslaught of progressives, they compromised over and over and over again until now what is considered quote-unquote conservative is further left in many ways than Democrat positions were back in the 1990s, let alone the 1950s. Then we have a man with more to lose than gain, Donald J. Trump, who looked at the field and as a patriot, a pragmatist, and someone who was old enough to have observed both the pinnacle and the slow decline of America, said he would answer the call to defend truth, justice, and the American way. So now I ask you, what is America built on? Is it grit, determination, individualism, patriotism, building communities, having self-confidence, and striving to provide a better opportunity for the next generation? Defending truth, justice, and that American way, reliance on God, guns, family, and community to defeat all enemies, both foreign and domestic, to stand tall against government oligarchy and take action to expunge corruption from all facets of our society? Well, I would say yes, and I would ask my opponent if those things are not the foundation of the conservative movement. And with that in mind, who else in the past 30 years has done this to the level of Trump? Who? The answer is no one. So is Trump good for conservatism? Well, if he hasn't been, then why were we on the edge of defeat in 2016 and now have the opportunity to keep America great again? And yet victory was snatched back then from the jaws of progressive tyranny. Guts and willingness to lose are what separates winners from losers, the strong from the weak, and those who are all talk and no action. Now, as president, has Trump been faced with enemies on all sides? Who are his friends? Who are the foes? The deceit, the intrigue, the level of all-out assault and attempts to defeat him make Machiavelli's The Prince seem like a book for children. And yet, in spite of this, in spite of activist judges attempting to block all reduction in government overreach, all attempts to defend our borders, to protect our economy, and to drain the swamp, in spite of almost all traditional and social media outlets conspiring to censor him and to prevent real change, has Trump surrendered on the core principles? I would say no. So I asked my opponent, is the man who has shown that by refusing to be weak and placate those who seek to destroy you can literally change the course of history, is he good for the conservative movement? I would say yes, absolutely. Obviously, we cannot look for the hypothetical perfect leader. That person does not exist. Politicians attempt to project this image and to take advantage of the uninformed sheep that are too stupid or lazy to see through their facades. Now, with Trump, what you see is what you get. He says what he means, and more importantly, does what he says. Outside of politics, what about that type of leadership is not exactly what we look for? Well, I can tell you from personal experience that in business and pretty much every other facet of leadership I've ever been involved in, the simple answer is that is exactly what you were looking for. And ironically, before he became president, he was considered that. Now, when he brought the style and the moves and the positions and the thought process to politics, somehow what was considered great leadership is now considered the antithesis. Interesting. What Trump says is portrayed by the media and the holier-than-thou never-Trumpers and the rhinos and the hyper-conservatives to be so crass, to be horrible and evil. Well, ironically, it's really no different than what almost every single person who will ever watch this video has said at some point in their lives, and many of you have thought similar things today, perhaps even while listening to my voice. So in closing, as we dialogue about this subject tonight, obviously we can get into the specifics of what he has done, what could have been done better, differently, and so on. And do I agree with all of his actions? Of course not. Do I think he didn't go far enough on some? Absolutely. But that has nothing to do with the subject at hand, which is the macro view. From the macro view, has Trump given life to the conservative movement? And the answer to that is yes. Has he inspired a whole generation of youth to face the opposition and to give no quarter, to refuse to yield to baseless accusations and attempts to force compromise in order to achieve objectives that are the polar opposite of your opponent? Well, I would say that given the fact the evidence is at hand, that we have active movement on the right to reach out to minority communities, to different groups that had been completely and utterly abandoned and considered lost by even the Tea Party movement of not that long ago. They had surrendered the African-American vote, the Hispanic vote, every other minority identity politics group that had been attacked and conquered by the left. They had surrendered, but not Trump. And now, as we face what will ultimately, in my opinion, go down as the most diabolical and influential and significant election in the history of the United States, and potentially a paradigm-shifting moment in the history of the world, we can rise to the occasion and follow someone who has given no quarter, who has risen to the occasion and faced down all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Or we can rely on purely hypothetical, strict ideologies that if somebody does not fulfill them 100%, they're viewed as a negative. Or we can be pragmatic optimists and look for those who may not be perfect, but do what it takes and rise to the occasion in the moments that matter. I yield.
All righty. Well, so just to be clear for the audience, I won't be directly responding to what John just said as far as the the opening. I'll be responding to that in our back and forth, and I'm going to use this time to make my own point, and then obviously use the like I said, back and forth time for the rebuttal. So, the question, is Trump good for conservatism, is a very interesting one to me personally, because as somebody who has often found myself arguing with conservatives for most of my life, this is not actually so much of a different question as it was back when Bush was president or back when Mitt Romney was running. Some of the reasons may certainly be different, but this has been something that people of my ilk, shall we say, have been long complaining about for some time: the lack of solid conservative leadership. One thing I will say, directly addressing something that Maddox had said in his opening statement, is that I actually agree that the Republican Party, or as I like to refer to them, the Rebloodlican Party, as it was termed by Jesse Ventura, who said the Democrats and Rebloodlicans, I happen to agree, they're basically gangs, but nonetheless, is full, for the most part, of people who are not truly conservatives, people who are lifelong bribe takers, people who are absolutely evil to their core. They're greedy. They have absolutely no care for the American people whatsoever. Mitt Romney was the Mormon version of Barack Obama, and John McCain was the very old version of Barack Obama, and Barack Obama was the slightly black version of George W. Bush, and so on and so forth. There's not, I think, like a kebab necessarily, or not kebab. That's funny. I'm gonna just basically a group, right? There's not a whole group necessarily, I think, of people going out, sacrificing goats per se, although there's some weird stuff in like Bohemian Grove and stuff like that that people could certainly look into. But there is certainly an elite class, if you will, of people who come from families of lifelong politicians who have basically lucked their way into getting their local Senate office, and then eventually made it to the Senate office for their state, or maybe they just left their high cushy position as the first lady to become the senator in a district they didn't even live in. Not that I'm talking about anybody in particular, but Hillary Clinton, so on and so forth. And obviously she's not a conservative, but you get the idea, right? George W. Bush was third generation. Mitt Romney's second generation politicians. These guys have all been in the whole these guys have all been in the whole, whatever you would call this, I guess, brouhaha for quite some time, right? However, just because somebody happens to be against those people does not actually necessarily mean that they are good. Now, I will again reiterate that what I am going to provide to you guys today is rather cynical and incredibly fatalistic. I don't think there's a solution to the problems which I aim to raise today. I do think that there was a way to avoid it. I think that way is long gone. At this point in time, I think that the Republican Party and indeed the conservative movement has gone so far to what Americans would traditionally consider to be the left that it actually is not salvageable anymore. And there are multiple reasons I believe that. And there are also other things associated with Donald Trump that I think will forever change politics. So let's address what I consider to be the three different pillars, if you will, of conservatism. What does it mean to be a conservative? Well, the first one and most obvious one, as far as it pertains to Trump, is social conservatism. Is Trump socially a conservative? Well, that's obviously hilarious, right? And we won't spend too much time on this because we probably agree that it's hilarious. He's thrice married, serial philanderer, somebody who's been associated with things like, gambling and strip clubs and beauty pageants and all that other kind of stuff. He's a celebrity. He's from New York, former big city Democrat, all that kind of stuff, right? So clearly that's not actually something that we would actually have much of a disagreement with, I would assume, at least. In fact, more often than not, a lot of Trump supporters tend to say, yeah, but they'll explain away that by either saying the alternative, or we're looking for a president, not a pastor, or perhaps some people will argue that he's changed, so on and so forth. There's numerous different reasons why people will argue against that. Now, it's one thing for us to actually make the claim that he's not a social conservative. It is a completely different thing for us to actually accurately articulate what exactly that means. Now, in my view, for a long period of time, it was conservatives and conservatives alone who operated as the dam, if you will, to repel the waves of just absolute debauchery in this country. Everything down from, we were talking about things like homosexual marriage at one point in time. We are now actually discussing things like cuties and WAP and Cardi B and stuff like that right now. Is that Trump's fault? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is Trump is a very clear and obvious sore that is showing us a symptom of a greater problem, namely that conservatism has actually forfeited its position as the dam that kept out all of the moral debauchery. If Kamala Harris were to be asked today some sort of a question about how she got into politics, which, as is very well known, was her sleeping with a married man so that he could very corruptly appoint her as the district attorney for his area, or maybe it was the city attorney. I guess I'm not 100% sure the exact position. Point being, she could easily, and granted, it's technically a too cool Clay fallacy, but that doesn't matter in the mind of the voter. She could easily turn right around and say, Trump, really? Thrice married, cheated with a porn star, constantly cheating on his wives, grabbing by the pussy? Are you serious? You're going to question my life? And the thing is she would be 100% right. Now, I happen to think Donald Trump operates as a dual exposure. Being somebody who believes in God, I think God has orchestrated Donald Trump to literally expose the United States, both the right and left, for what they truly are. I think the right is, for the most part, not actually concerned with what was truly considered to be conservatism for a long period of time, but is actually a lot more concerned with, I think, what we considered a flashy 80s style capitalism that relies primarily on a lot of quote unquote success, but not a lot of substance behind that success. Right. And of course, Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and numerous other economists have talked about how you can have periods of time that appear to be very successful from a prosperity standpoint, but they end up inevitably leading to bubbles. Those bubbles pop, the economy collapses, the debt increases, so on and so forth, which I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But the point being that, to get back to the point about this first reason, right, him not being socially conservative, Trump is sort of the perfect example of conservatives giving up that moral high ground. 81% evangelical vote will never go away. Democrats will always remember that, even if it's a too cool Quay argument, right? And that's not something the Republicans are going to get back, in my opinion, barring some sort of what I would at least term personally as a miracle. Maybe it wouldn't literally be a miracle, but a huge change in the way that our society is currently going, right? We see that he has been somebody who accepts homosexuality, so that's obviously just done away with. The big one that he is considered to be actually on our side socially with is the pro-life argument. But to be perfectly frank with you, there's been virtually nothing done on the pro-life side that actually really matters. And I'll get to that in a little second. But the point being that Trump, in my opinion, encapsulates what was done before him. It's not necessarily his fault, but the point is he perfectly encapsulates this lack of protection that the United States now currently has from moral debauchery, because he himself is morally debased, and yet he is the hierarch of what was considered to be the protection and the hedge against that moral debauchery. The second thing we would ask is he politically conservative? Well, conservatism usually, and I assume that you would probably agree, but just in case you don't, go ahead and correct me when we go back and forth, right? But conservatism is defined primarily by small government and high respect for the Constitution. Also, typically a high level of patriotism, though that's not necessarily required. It's usually a given. Most conservatives are patriots, right? And for the most part, all the other things we tend to talk about tend to fit into that. We tend to want a prosperous society, but of course, so did the left. They just think that it can be achieved through stupid means like Marxism or some mix of Marxism or Keynesian economics or something like that. Point being, so are his policies actually conservative? Do they show us a level of respect for the Constitution, small levels of spending, small government, so on and so forth? Well, the answer is obviously no. So he's been okay with things like the USA Patriot Act and Real ID Act and so on and so forth. Things that he did not actually originally sign into law. Those were actually both in particular signed into law by George W. Bush, but things which Barack Obama before him, George W. Bush before him, and he as well have done absolutely nothing to do, have done absolutely nothing to stop, rather, right? When it comes to groups like Edward Snowden, the Bundys, Chelsea Manning, who obviously is formerly Bradley Manning, right? These people tend to either be completely forgotten by Donald Trump. Julian Assange is another really good example of that, or only actually pardoned by Trump when it starts to become politically convenient, like the Hammond family, which shows, in my opinion, what is true, which is that he's a populist. He doesn't really have beliefs per se, as much as he has an idea that he wants the society to be prosperous and also that he wants to be the president. When it comes to things like gun rights, Donald Trump has advocated suppressor bans. Donald Trump has been for bump stock bans. Donald Trump has been for red flag laws, which are not only an egregious violation of the Second Amendment, but an egregious violation of the Fourth Amendment as well. Speaking of disrespect for the Constitution, Donald Trump has famously endorsed not only waterboarding, but a hell of a lot more than waterboarding, as he has stated. Numerous people consider waterboarding to be torture, numerous experts, I would point out. And a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding is definitely an outright endorsement of torture. The Constitution very clearly states we are not to have cruel and unusual punishment, so on and so forth, right? So we see a pattern of, and by the way, this isn't unique to Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, George W. Bush, so on and so forth, but a pattern of disrespect for the United States Constitution. Another perfect example of this, when we saw Syria bombed with a very impressive display, by the way. I'm not going to pretend that dropping 50 Tomahawk missiles overnight on somebody was not impressive. However, according to the definition set up by the Constitution, not necessarily a colloquial definition, not necessarily a dictionary definition, but the definition that our founders would have used, that was tyrannical on Donald Trump's part. Why? Because he did not ask the Congress for a declaration of war or to move any troops. In fact, there has been no declaration of war since World War II. Once again, his predecessors are fully guilty of this, Clinton, Obama, Bush. This has not been something that's changed. However, these quote-unquote forever wars are actually not constitutionally defined as wars. You can't legally call them wars. Donald Trump is just as guilty as that as anybody else. And in fact, if one actually looks at what he did objectively, he sent 50 Tomahawk missiles on a foreign nation, at least according to his son, on the whims of his daughter, at least partially, right? Now, his son could be wrong about that, and that could only be a partial point if his son is not wrong about that. However, point is, Eric Trump said that it was basically, at least partially, on the whims of Ivanka Trump and her feelings that Donald Trump decided to send 50 Tomahawk missiles onto a foreign nation, which is an egregious violation of the Constitution. And like I said, so on and so forth with this pattern of disrespect for the United States Constitution. And just because I'm limited on time, I'll move on. The last thing I would say is fiscally conservative. Do we have any evidence that Donald Trump is fiscally conservative? Well, that is absolutely hilarious, in my opinion. Now, there were people who were fiscally conservative in the past. That seems to be something that is completely and totally dead in the Republican Party. I think the last truly fiscally conservative Republican that I remember was Ron Paul, who retired after the 2012 election cycle when he failed to get the presidential nomination. But nonetheless, to give you guys an idea, the 2019 fiscal year, which was approved well before we had anything that had anything to do with COVID, had a $964 billion deficit. Barack Obama did not have a deficit that big in any of his 4 final years. Okay, so, and that is before COVID, when Trump obviously got, our deficit this year is going to be in the multiples of trillions, which of course is not strictly Donald Trump's fault. It also has a lot to do with Pelosi, McConnell, and a bunch of other people who quite frankly have no idea how they're going to pay for all this. But even before that absolutely ridiculously egregious spending on COVID, there was still $964 billion in deficit, nearly a full $1 trillion in deficit for the 2019 fiscal year. That is the exact opposite of fiscally conservative. Donald Trump has done absolutely nothing to bring down the debt. In fact, if anything, he's made it worse because of the fact that he is not willing to actually go toe-to-toe with China. What he does with China ends up costing us more money. Now, he is right that we need to have trade wars with China. The problem is he doesn't actually have the what would you call that? The chutzpah, I guess, to follow through with what he's been going through with. Now, in some instances, he gets small victories, but what we really want, as Donald Trump used to state, if we go back to 2011, 2012, even 2015, Donald Trump, what we really want would be a return to our strength in manufacturing, as well as a little bit of a peak in our own currency's value, as well as a little bit of fair trade deals with China, as well as what was it? Sorry, there's another moment here. I'm kind of, you know what? It'll come to me at a random time when we're going back and forth, so it doesn't matter. But there was another thing that he had mentioned that was very important with China. Oh, right, yeah. An agreement with China. We're not going to have any sort of a deal with you at all if you're not going to play by certain rules. For example, you don't get to hack Sony, right? It's specifically American Sony employees. You don't get to send the interview, for example, and the people who worked on the interview, all that information to the North Korean government so that they can start threatening people because the hamster who runs North Korea is a little bit upset that somebody made fun of him, right? You don't get to do those sorts of things. Trump backed down on virtually all of that. And by the way, as it just so happens, the trade deficit, which was another one of the big things I wanted to get rid of, just so happened to have gotten worse, right? The only thing he ended up actually getting is a trade deal that in the end did give a little bit of what you could kind of term, I guess, as a benefit for farmers. It's a little bit of a benefit for farmers. He actually touted this in his recent debate with Joe Biden. It's kind of like a subsidy, for lack of a better term, though. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like this actually offered a serious relief to farmers, considering farmers all over the country are getting bought out by massive real estate corporations, which, to be fair, has a lot to do with state level politics and not a lot to do with federal. I digress, though. The point being, and we'll get more into the nitty gritty, obviously, because I don't want to take too much time. I think I've been rambling. The point being, Donald Trump does not meet any of the three criteria. He's not financially conservative. He is not politically conservative. He is not personally conservative. And as a result, the conservative movement continues to go farther to the left, in my estimation. Donald Trump has famously had the defense from people like Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Dave Rubin, and so on, that his rhetoric was used by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And honestly, my only point is to completely agree. But Bill Clinton was a Democrat, and we need to remember that. And with that, I would yield.
Well, thanks, man. That was a good exposition, and by the way, everybody, make sure you go and check out CJ's channel. I got the link in the description, and for anybody who wants to do Q&A afterwards, save your questions, write them down somewhere, type them up, get them ready. Do not post them in live chat until we are way closer to the end, because there's no mod, nobody's paying attention. I'm not going to be paying attention to live chat and grabbing your questions, so save them for the end. So let's get into it's open discussion. So I don't disagree with you that Trump is not the ideal embodiment of the traditional conservative. I agree with you. He is not. The point I'm making is that of all the people who have been portrayed as and claimed to be that persona, they did literally nothing. And in the context, but to address your specific points, the China issue, I think you're looking way too short term. I mean, when you look at things like from the 80s, for example, this applies both to taxes, tax revenue, and deficits, and both from a federal perspective as well as a trade perspective. In the Reagan's tax cuts that went into effect 1982, and then there was a spike in deficits, a reduction in tax revenue, and then by the time he left office, tax revenue had literally doubled. But it took time for that to kick in. I think we were prior to COVID, we were getting ready to hit that spike. So I think to argue on things like trade deficits, and I don't disagree with you on the ridiculousness of the federal budget deficit. However, I think presidents get way too much blame for that. It's the incompetence of the legislature, which, as you know, the spending bills come from the House, and so I think to apply all the blame to him, say he's not conservative enough because of a Democrat-controlled House, especially in this past 2 years, I don't know if that's necessarily fair because we got a bunch of idiots both sides. McConnell's a freaking coward, and so there's a lot of the point I was making in my opening statement, just to kind of put all my ramble here into context, to turn back over to you, is all of the problems that you were listing were exponentially more difficult to counter when literally the people who claim to be your friends are your enemy. And I mean, I can't think of anyone in the history of the United States for sure who has had to deal with more backstabbing enemies than Donald J. Trump. Would you agree with that?
So I absolutely would, but I would remind both you and the audience that it wasn't actually only Trump who was on the outside. It ended up being primarily Trump. The Republican Party actually had a little bit of a crisis in 2016, if we remember, because on one end you had Donald Trump, who a lot of people thought he was a kind of like a Democrat spy or whatever you would call it, mole, I guess is the better word, right? Other people thought that he was obviously kind of like Kanye's campaign 2020, and other people still, even though they ended up, and this ended up actually being a positive for him because a lot of his supporters ended up agreeing, saw him more as like your traditional right-wing populism kind of guy, Americana, as Alex Jones famously put it. Alex Jones ended up in 2016, if we all remember, right, being a big part of the whole Donald Trump movement, as did many other people, not just him, Milo Yiannopoulos, right, Gavin McInnes, all those guys. So Ted Cruz was the guy who Donald Trump beat as far as being second place, right? And if you recall, John Kasich and Jeb Bush and Mitch McConnell and all these guys were sitting there, metaphorically sweating bullets, because it was like, really, Trump or Cruz? Not a single establishment guy in there, because Cruz was the firebrand constitutional Republican. I'm going to pardon Edward Snowden, and also we should prosecute people from Guantanamo Bay kind of conservative, right? And he did exist, and not only did he exist, he nearly won. I would argue, not that this is obvious, not that we're getting necessarily religious here, but I would argue without the evangelical support that was actually given to Trump, Cruz would have won. It's a mystery to me why evangelicals ended up supporting Donald Trump in mass and not Cruz in mass, because Cruz tended to represent them more as far as his personality was concerned.
Because they knew that Cruz wasn't going to beat Hillary Clinton.
See, I got to be honest with you. I don't know that. I think it would be very difficult for a Republican in 2016 to lose to Hillary Clinton. I think Donald Trump certainly.
Hang on. He won by less than 80,000 votes.
He was also despised, though. Let's bear in mind. Like, let's see if we had somebody like, for example, a Ben Carson, who was maybe, who would obviously have the typical attacks against a right-wing politician like George Bush did, but maybe wouldn't be as polarizing as Donald Trump. He probably not only would have won, but could have even potentially won the popular vote. One of the things we see in politics quite frequently, right? You got 8 years of Reagan. Reagan happened to be particularly popular, so you got 4 years of his vice. But then you have 8 years of Clinton, and then you have 8 years of Bush, and then you have 8 years of Obama, right? So just based off of the trends that we have from the past, it's another part of the reason why, like, for example, when Republicans lost the House in 2018, well, this doesn't really surprise anybody because that's pretty typical. You have a president switch, you tend to have the House in the same party as the president when you switch, and then he loses the very next time because that's just the way politics works in America for some reason, right? So barring, I think, some really weak, like Mitt Romney clone, like a John Kasich, which, to be fair, he still might have been able to win because George Bush is one of those weak kind of guys. He would be, obviously, before Mitt Romney, he'd be like a Bob Dole clone, if you will. But George Bush Jr. was like, he lucked his way into politics, right? He was the president because it just so happened that his dad was president, and his dad got into politics because it just so happened that his dad was a banker who was really into politics. You know what I mean? Like, these guys have links to Richard Nixon and the Rockefellers and all this kind of stuff. And I don't mean that in a conspiratorial sense. I mean that in the literal sense. Like, they're just members of the elite. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. The point is that even somebody who was weak and wishy-washy and not at all a conservative like John Kasich could have potentially won.
No, dude, you're that's like saying that having a second round of Mitt Romney is going to win. I mean, that you're saying that the same type of, okay, think about how much animosity there was against Obama in 2012. Tons. Turnout, tons. People wanted to stop Obama. And Romney, by being wishy-washy and not drawing lines in the sand, lost. And historically, if you actually look at it, the centrists don't win.
Well,
Like,
and that might be
the reality is, I mean, think about Reagan. Reagan was the polar opposite of Jimmy Carter.
right.
He made the point to brand himself as the polar opposite of Jimmy Carter. It's exactly what Trump did. The polar opposite of Hillary Clinton.
Right,
None of the Republicans were doing that, and except for potentially a Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz is not he's not a national leader. Ted Cruz, I know he hates this and he talks about it, he doesn't want to have this. Ted Cruz would be fantastic on the Supreme Court. As president, no. He does not have the dynamism that's required to beat the media at their own game and to beat the left and their level of brainwashing. Because something I think that folks like you and I have to remember is that 99% of the United States population knows 1% about politics in comparison to us. And it's very easy for us to think there's no way that people could actually be this ignorant. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. That's the unfortunate reality we live in. I mean, I think it's being embodied by what's going on with COVID right now. I mean, you talk about like suspension of constitutional liberties. I mean, people are willfully surrendering. And then when they're told it's violating the Constitution, it's like, well, it's okay. Or they don't even realize they have the right to argue against, these unlawful orders. And so anyway, the point I'm making in all this is, and this goes back to the topic at hand of, is Trump good for conservatism? I don't argue that he is the paradigm pinnacle of what we would want as a quote unquote true conservative. The point I'm making is that he, from a macro view, gives evidence to the conservative movement that, hey, we can win. Even without taking every piece of the puzzle. Trump is vilified by the media and every talking head out there, including John Kasich, who's endorsing Joe Biden.
Right.
That he's a right wing. Trump is being branded as the most hardcore right wing of all time, which we know he is not.
Right, exactly. He's not even. In fact, I would argue, just to be clear, one of my criticisms of Trump, I don't think. I mean, obviously that's what we're talking about today, right? I don't think he's right wing enough. You know what I mean? Like, it's clearly not the case that Donald Trump is a hardcore right winger or a fascist. I would argue, obviously, that as I've kind of already hinted to, I do think he's a statist, but I think that everybody in the higher ups at this point is a statist. I think that statism is sort of the default, both for the voting populace for the most part and for the people who run for office. And I think it's because it's the default of the voting populace. Obviously they're going to vote for it.
I would have to say that in context of Trump, I mean, in terms of battling the state concept, I mean, the fact of the matter is he has reduced a ridiculous amount of government regulation. Like, that is a fact. And,
I'll give credit.
And ultimately where I'm going with this too is in the overall context of, like, do I agree with him? And do I think he's like a pure social conservative? Of course I don't. Do I think he's a fiscal conservative in the manner in which I would like? Absolutely not. I wish he would have vetoed everything and just, called all the bluffs and said, forget you guys. I think you also have to remember from a pragmatic perspective, right? Like, the level of corruption is to such a degree that it's on which battlefront do I fight first, right? I'm talking about in first term. And I think in the context of what we observed through the activist judges and all of the stuffed courts of, liberal activist judge stuffed courts across the United States. I mean, the level of judge hunting that went on, and somehow their injunctions being recognized on national levels rather than their districts. I mean, what the hell is that? Number one.
Right.
But secondarily, when you think about the level of obstruction that's having to be countered, I mean, you can't expect somebody who, short of being tyrannical, right? Short of violating all constitutional limitations, can't do all the things that the conservative would love for him to be able to do. And that's why I say, in the context of, do I think that he is good from the macro level? Absolutely. It's like, what do you expect from the man in the context of right now? If it was the 1980s, totally different dynamic, right? Because society was totally different. I'm talking politically. It was way different. Heck, it was. How old are you, CJ?
I'm 22, actually.
You're 22. Okay, so I'm 36. So I'm old enough to remember and to have observed like the utter collapse that has occurred in my adult life. And like, I moved back to the States from England the day after my 18th birthday. So from 18 till now, I have been in the United States, like living, even though I'm an American. And I've watched it. Like, I joke about this, but the slow boiling frog versus the frog being dropped in the boiling water.
Right.
Like, I felt like the frog dropped in the boiling water, and I've watched this degradation going on, and I recognize the level of accelerated difference that's happened. I mean, whether it be identity politics, racial issues, left-right divisions, fiscal irresponsibility. I mean, for example, when Obama took office, the federal budget was 2.7 trillion. By the time he left, it was 4.3. I mean, it's insanity when you think about that in the context of like, oh, well, it's just not that much. Oh yeah, there's only 6 countries on this planet with a GDP greater than 1 trillion. So when you really start to put these things into context, like, the level of corruption is so mammoth. I mean, the premise of even being able to take it on and having the proverbial C.O. Jones to try, to me, gives you like gigantic leeway. Like, I don't agree with everything that you do, but holy crap, you had the backbone to try. Like, we got to give the man some serious credit for doing that. You see where I'm coming from on that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And believe me, I understand why people admire Donald Trump. And, I would even say there's a lot of things about Donald Trump that I personally admire. One thing that, shockingly enough, now this is old news because right around 2017, all of a sudden, Bernie Sanders changed his tune on this. But shockingly enough, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and I would all actually have the same opinion originally, at least when it came to 2016, on trade and protectionism and tariffs and things like that. And chances are you probably agree too. Believe it or not, Bernie was very conservative on that issue before 2016. Pat Buchanan obviously was the one who popularized a lot of this stuff back in the 90s when he tried to unseat Bush Senior in 92. Or repopularized, I should say, because it was the traditional conservative opinion, 50, 60 years prior. And I agree with Trump a lot on that. And a lot of people don't actually have the willingness to say stuff like that. And there's even some people who I think are more conservative than Trump, like, for example, Ron Paul's son, who I think his trade opinions are incredibly naive. They're horribly naive. The whole free trade libertarian thing, I think, is just, you live in a fantasy world. And I've lived in that fantasy world. So I say that with a little bit of, tongue-in-cheek sarcasm and care for these guys. But I do think, like, that's just not the way the world works. You know what I mean? That said, though, the things that Trump fails on, I think, make it to where there's virtually no difference between him and his predecessors. I won't say him and the people trying to unseat him now, because the left took some sort of a crazy pill right around 2016 that it's just, we all thought that Hillary Clinton was bad, but it really wouldn't matter, I guess, if it was Joe Biden or anyone else. But the left in general, 2020 is something that we really haven't seen since like 1860 territory. But when you in comparison to his predecessors, it's either he fails at the places that make it irrelevant, or he fails at places that make it so conservatism will in the end have a net negative. So let me give 2 examples for each one. So the first one is budget. Now, obviously, Trump doesn't have to sit there and veto absolutely everything, although there are some people who said they would. Ron Paul, and I think he probably was telling the truth, considering the fact that he in Congress voted no on almost every single bill over his 20-year tenure. You know what I mean? So he probably would be that guy to veto until he got his way. There's very few Ron Pauls. Understand that. That said, there's a lot of stuff that Trump as the executive could do to reduce that budget without actually even, in fact, he would be constitutionally obligated to do these things under some circumstances, at least constitutionally able, and could bypass Congress completely. For example, getting rid of, say, the Department of Homeland Security. That might sound like kind of a crazy thing for a lot of people, but that was actually a conservative opinion for a very long period of time. George Bush was somewhat of an oddball for endorsing something like the Secretary of Homeland Security, because in reality, the Secretary of Homeland Security could be renamed to the Department could be renamed the Department of Redundancy Department, because quite frankly, the Homeland Security and defense are the exact same thing. We have a military. It already accomplishes that task, right? That in and of itself is like something like $200 billion, I think, at its height. I don't know if it's necessarily that big now, because it goes and fluctuates between how much money we get to it. At the time Ron Paul was suggesting getting rid of it, it was about that much, but that was back in 2008.
Quick interjection. There's actually the Government Accountability Office, actually part of their audit every year actually includes duplicate agencies. And the last time I looked was back in 2016. And at the time, there were 284 duplicate agencies. They were deemed duplicate by the Government Accountability Office.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in context of spending, and this is one of the things in context of, and this is where Congress comes back into play, of they keep funding these things, even though they had this report every year, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger. But the irony of ironies, when I looked at it back in 2016, the average budget per agency was $2 billion. So you do some extraordinarily basic math, and you're at what, 558 or whatever it is, or sorry, what did I say, 284? Yeah, 558. $68 billion, $500 billion just being spent on duplicate agencies. Now, to put that in context, right now we're spending like 400 and something billion on just an interest on the national debt. So when you really think about this in terms of the levels of gross incompetency that's happening in Washington, D.C., you just have to think about it from that, in that little perspective there. Now, I agree with your point on things like, hey, so he could take these actions, right? I think you also have to remember, like, how many fronts can you take on simultaneously?
Well, personally, I think that, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of fronts and there's a lot of ways to take on those fronts, and we're not all going to agree on all of them, because that's just the nature of life. But there are some which I think are non-negotiable for conservatism, and I think those are budget, particularly budget and respect for the Constitution. I wouldn't necessarily throw abortion in there per se. That's a definite one for me, and I think Trump fails on that one. But that isn't necessarily a definite one for conservatism per se, right? I think
I would disagree with you on the abortion one. Not necessarily that it's a. I think it is a conservative position by all, in pretty much every facet. I would disagree with you on Trump not addressing that one.
Well, so let me ask a question, right? And this is the question I have personally been unable to find a satisfactory response to. So now, granted, it's only $1 billion about, right? Give or take, I think 2 or 4 points on that. But nonetheless, roughly $1 billion that we give to Planned Parenthood and groups like it every year in our budget. Not a lot, but it's enough to be, obviously noteworthy. Conservatives have talked about defunding Planned Parenthood for my entire lifetime, at least. I'm not sure how far that got. I know Alan Keyes brought it up in the 1996 election, and he was considered somewhat of a pariah for doing so. So maybe before like maybe right around that time is when that became a conservative talking point day in and day out, rather than just one group of conservatives. But the point is, now, how difficult really would it be to say I'm not going to sign this budget until this is defunded, especially when you have a Republican Senate and a Republican House of Representatives. That's the position Donald Trump found himself in for his first 2 years of presidency. Nothing, right? We could not get Planned Parenthood funded. That's not an investigation. That's not overturning Roe v. Wade, right? That's a very small thing, and especially if you consider, right, if the thing we're fighting here is killing children, right? Not having taxpayer money go to funding the killing of children is like the least we could ask for. You know what I mean? Let alone something like making it.
Who was the Speaker of the House at that time?
Say it again.
Who was Speaker of the House in that 2-year period you're referring to?
I believe at that time it was still Paul Ryan, if I'm not mistaken.
It was. And who, in context of the actions taken by Trump, right, that he's being blamed for in this context, Paul Ryan will go down in history as the softest, most incompetent, one of the most incompetent Republican speakers of the House in history.
Agreed.
I mean, they never even brought Obamacare to a vote. I mean, during the time in which you're talking about, when they controlled the Senate, all three branches of government, or not three, all three the houses and the White House.
Right.
It shows how I love civics. I'm making sure to not make that mistake that so many liberal, uninformed idiots do. They don't know the separation of powers, the branches of government. They think that the Senate and the House and the White House are the three branches. Forget about the judiciary. The point I'm making is that looking back in hindsight that we're doing right now, I think a lot of people blame Trump for things and kind of forget about. And I remember being pissed at Paul Ryan during that time frame. I'm just like, at what point are you going to realize this is why you guys are incompetent little idiots who can't maintain power? Is because you never do anything. You are, as Trump loves to say, you are all talk, zero action. Even when you don't even have, like, the road is yours, right? And then now Trump for the last 2 years has had a split legislature to deal with, right? And Nancy Pelosi, who is quite arguably one of the most corrupt speakers of the House in history of the United States, right? So it's like, okay, we have a literal paradigm shift that's happened in terms of who is this arguably the second most powerful person in the United States, Nancy Pelosi versus Paul Ryan. But then Trump gets blamed for the incompetence of Paul Ryan. Now, I agree with you in the context of, could he have vetoed everything? Yes. Well, something that Trump did do was he actually refused to allow funding. I forget the law right now, but he refused to allow foreign aid that goes to abortion to be sent.
Yeah, the Mexico City policy, they call it. That's kind of a colloquial name, but that's
I forget the exact term. Yeah, well, that's the colloquial term. You're right. I forget the exact what it is, but that is action. It's like, okay, would we prefer to have happened, the same action have been taken here in the United States? Yes. We also you have to look at things from a pragmatic perspective I'm talking about, especially in the context of that first 2 years of you have an idiot controlling. And let's get real. Mitch McConnell is, as leader of the Senate, that guy is so incompetent. He's equally spineless. He somehow gets things done only at the very absolute last minute and don't even achieve the vast majority. He accomplishes like one or two options and like surrenders everything else. It's amazing. The idiots that are somehow controlling the Republican Party. But my long-winded point is, we can't, in context of our discussion right now tonight, the reason I think that Trump hasn't been able to accomplish a lot of the things that the ideal conservative would like is that not only has he been blocked by members of his own party and the left and the media and big tech and the ridiculous amount of judges who have overreached their power, and then the compromised Supreme Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roberts, I mean, Roberts is compromised. It is so obvious that man is completely. I'm so grateful, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Barrett gets confirmed, because Roberts is going to lean towards the left in the inevitable lawsuits that happen in relation to the election. But the point I'm making is, it's like you've got Trump, who for the first 2 years and even now hasn't been able to confirm all the people to go, his people to go into different agencies and such. It's like, you not only all the people, the enemies I've just listed, you've also got the bureaucracy of all the agencies. I mean, when you have the National Intelligence Director and all those different the intelligence community people who are actively spewing propaganda and taking action against you when you're the president of the United States and you're having to battle your own intelligence community who are attempting to get you impeached. Right. I mean, good Lord. That's why I go back to this whole thing of like, does Trump fulfill all the things? No. But is he something to like, okay, if he can survive all of this, then what the heck have we been doing and not rising to the occasion?
See, but I think that kind of goes back a little bit to my point of like, in that example, what ends up being the difference then, right? Because George Bush enacted the Mexico City policy also, right? And, you know, it's interesting. You look at Trump's judge picks. Gorsuch has turned out to be rather disappointing, especially because had you asked me in 2016 to line these three judges up based on their records before they got to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch would have been my favorite. And as it turns out, Gorsuch is actually not always on what I would consider to be an originalist side. I won't necessarily say the right side per se, although that's what I agree it to be. You know what I mean? But like, for example, you take somebody like Amy Coney Barrett. Now, Amy Coney Barrett actually has a lot of very positive qualities about her, for sure. And Amy Coney Barrett, to her credit, is the only one of the three who has definitively said that she has a constitutional issue with Roe v. Wade. Both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch were very wishy-washy. Gorsuch outright said that it is precedent, and as precedent must stand. So Gorsuch just absolutely is not interested in that train, right? However, there's some problems with Amy Coney Barrett that if somebody, I think, had a truly constitutional, truly conservative mindset, that they would cause them to honestly pass her over. Not hate her or anything. She can be in appeals court. But like, for example, Amy Coney Barrett has ruled in favor of forced vaccinations. Now, I'm not anti-vax. Vaccinations are good. You should get your vaccinations. They don't cause autism, etc. Right. However, as an American, I absolutely have the right to not accept a forced vaccination. We're all talking about that right now with things like COVID, right? That's not, and by the way, how ironic that somebody who happens to be a conservative and a darling of the right is put forward and also happens to agree with something like mandatory vaccination. I'm not necessarily going conspiracy. I'm just saying it's weird. And by the way, just really quick, sometimes I do go conspiratorial when I don't necessarily mean a conspiracy. The thing is I do believe God is in control, and I happen to believe that America is doomed. So I honestly think that's where we're going, and I don't think there's necessarily a cabal. I just think that that's the way that the country's going. I apologize, but nonetheless.
Well, to address that point there, no, I would agree with you completely. I honestly, I said this when Trump won and we started running, was that Trump is God's temporary timeout before the ultimate collapse of humanity. I mean, the only thing, and this I'm doing it from a historic perspective and a pragmatic, real world standpoint as well, the United States is the only thing that stands between global domination, tyranny, and one world government. And the irony of Trump winning and being the one person true, I'm not going from a leadership power, actual somebody can make a difference perspective, standing tall and giving no, like, there is no question that Trump is against globalism, right? And that's the ultimate irony for me, because I agree with you in context of God being in control, and I do think he was put in that position. And I also think that when you look at different things that Trump is doing, I think they're being done in spite of him and his background and things he did, which is why I think there's even more evidence that he was put there on purpose, both to stop things, but also to showcase to those of us who believe where things truly stand. But enough of my long-winded diatribe. Continue.
Well, no, that's perfectly all right, though. You know what I mean? And I would like to point out briefly. Actually, you know what? I'm going to finish what I was saying, and then I'll point something out there. But so the point being, with Amy Coney Barrett, right? There's some, from a constitutional perspective, there's some problems with Amy Coney Barrett, and unfortunately, we don't have enough time to talk about them because the left wants to attack her for having the audacity to have children and be a religious woman, right? And the same thing happened to Kavanaugh, by the way. Kavanaugh, fun fact, has ruled in favor of the inability of citizens to actually sue sitting officials in government. That should be terrifying to most people. Now, there were founders who agreed with Kavanaugh on this. I do want to be clear. Those founders were wrong, right? The founders were not gods, that they could be wrong sometimes. George Washington happened, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, all three happened to be against it. And there is good reason for that, right? You should be able to, under, of course, certain parameters, because you can't just be suing the government for every wish thing in the entire world and get them bogged down with litigation. There should be the ability to actually go after the government for wrongdoing, right? Especially if it can be definitively proven that they have committed some level of wrongdoing. We do this all the time. You can take the government to civil court, right? Sue them for wrongful death or whatever, right? Something along those lines. Kavanaugh happens to believe that that's not something that's cool. That's just one particular example, right? Now, we never got the chance to address that because everybody had all these ridiculously false allegations propagated by celebrities like Michael Avenatti, who are masquerading as lawyers, right? And so as a result, we had to defend him for that because that was a matter of his character, which, to be fair, is the more important thing at that point. The man shouldn't be slandered, right? But we never got to address the substance, which is, are you really an originalist judge who's going to defend us? Another fun fact about that, Kavanaugh's a little bit wishy-washy on the gun issue, kind of. It's not like he's not like definitively, I would take guns sort of thing or anything like that. But Kavanaugh has openly stated before that there is some level of constitutionality behind what people would call common sense gun reform, right? Like red flag laws and things of that nature, which is always a Trojan horse. We have something like 28 different Western nations to prove that, right? Because they all did it, and now they all don't have firearms anymore. Britain, Ireland, Canada, France, so on and so forth. You know what I mean? And Gorsuch actually, surprisingly, was the only one with a solid history, and it turned out that Gorsuch, in a lot of ways, is lacking, and that's unfortunate. But he's not lacking in every single way. Obviously, he has said outright that he has no interest in doing anything about Roe v. Wade, and has also ruled in favor of some very, what I would call, less than originalist rulings. For example, the whole thing saying you can't discriminate on transgenderism based on the 14th Amendment, which, I mean, look, here's the thing. I'm not going to get too big into that issue because we could obviously go on a tangent on that for hours, but people need to have the ability to say, hey, this job is something that we have for females. Like, for example, I don't know, off the top of my head, a rape counselor. You know what I mean? That was an egregious ruling on Gorsuch's part. And obviously that wasn't Trump's fault because Gorsuch has a solid history. But the point is, he had two who did not have a solid history. And the one who did is turning out, at least on the surface initially, to be a flop. So his judges on the Supreme Court really aren't that impressive in the long run. They could,
but who
very badly in some very bad ways.
But who presented them to him?
Well, and to be fair, I think Trump does have some people around him who are probably not particularly wise. Trump has actually had members of the outright swamp in his cabinet before. I think the most, egregious example is John Bolton, because, I mean, geez, how did you manage to get somebody like John Bolton? Now, to be fair, I'm sure that John Bolton was somewhat of an olive branch to the Romneyite, Bushite kind of conservatives in that sort of way. It didn't work, but lo and behold, that's what happened there. There was the guy before Pompeo, I'm trying to remember his name, Tillerson. Tillerson was as warmonger as I have ever seen a Secretary of State ever be. Now, obviously, 22 years, not very long. But Tillerson was like, nah, we're going to invade China, and we're going to invade Venezuela, and we're going to invade North Korea, and I want more troops in Syria. War is awesome. You know what I mean? And, that's obviously not something that I'm particularly cool with. Now,
to be fair, though, you don't necessarily expect the former CEO of Exxon to be a crazy hawk on that level either.
Right.
And here's the thing: you also have to remember that Trump's fired a bunch of people too. And however, in context of this conversation, this goes back to my point in my opening statement of Did he go far enough? Has he done everything perfect? No. But that's not the point. The point is that, is he better than Hillary Clinton? Yes. But in the context of the previous folks who are who have claimed, I'm talking about in Washington, right, that have claimed to be conservatives, what have they gotten done?
Well, with some of them, they didn't actually have the power. Now, obviously, with a lot of them, we would agree. McConnell, we're going to agree, and with the Bushes, we're going to agree, and with Romney and a lot of these guys,
I'm not just talking about presidents. I'm talking about, because since Reagan, there hasn't been a quote unquote conservative, traditional conservative president.
But so, for example,
I'm talking about the people that have held office in government leading up to this. Like, we've had tons of them that have been supposedly conservatives and been recognized as these, true conservatives. They got nothing done.
Well, to be fair, they're typically not given power. And I honestly believe, and I know this will be controversial and some people might not like it, but I honestly believe that the reason Donald Trump did get power has somewhat to do with the short attention span of people in general. It's not an insult on his particular followers. It's just, so let me just go on the whole diatribe, right? So I could name in each of the elections where there was serious competition in the Republican Party, at least since 1992, somebody who I would trust as good for conservatism who ran for president. In fact, I can just do it briefly right now. Buchanan in 92 and 96, Keyes in 96 and 2000, Forbes and Huckabee. No, Huckabee didn't go in 2000. Sorry. Forbes, 2000 and 96 as well. Somebody who I think could be trusted. The Constitution Party in 1992, 96, 2000, 2004, and 2008, even though all of those are a third party, as well as Ross Perot in 92 and 96 are people I would trust. Ron Paul in 2008 and 12. We had Mike Huckabee in 2008, who I would have trusted. Fred Thompson, who I would have trusted, right? There's a lot of people who were genuinely concerned. In fact, Ron Paul, I mean, you want to talk about a guy, who got as much done at least as he could, because being a representative of, District 14 in Texas doesn't give you the greatest amount of power in the world. But we're talking about a guy who consistently voted no on every single increase in spending that was put before him, voted no on every single military action, with the exception of military action against Osama bin Laden after 9/11, because obviously that's justified military action. Talking about a guy who was staunchly pro-life to the point of even suggesting amending the Constitution so that there was no ambiguity whatsoever about the definite, you know what I mean? Everything he could have done, he did do. And unfortunately, because he's not super flashy, Republicans did not support him in 2008 or 2012 when he ran for president. Ted Cruz, honestly, barring a Donald Trump who just happened to be more flashy, probably could have gotten 2016, and he's much of the same. Ted Cruz famously filibustered the Congress because he was saying, we literally cannot allow this vote of Obamacare to go through because this is completely egregious. It's tyranny on the American people, medical tyranny, right? For something like 28 hours, something like that, right? Him and Rand Paul and Mike Lee back in 2000, I think 13, maybe 14, had their little trio about, which by the way turned out to be exactly right. They basically predicted the future, but had their trio in Congress where they sat up there and said, hey, don't give any weapons to the Free Syrian Army. They will become terrorists, and those terrorists will become very powerful. And ISIS, of course, the very next year had control of half of Iraq and Syria because those people were right. Rand Paul and Ted Cruz both ran for president in 2016, right? Huckabee also ran again in 2016. The only reason these guys don't win is because they're not flashy. Trump is flashy, and therefore he wins. And honestly, as a result of that, political analysts could have said, and I did before I was a political analyst, as a 17-year-old kid, as soon as Donald Trump ran, told all, and this isn't a brag, honestly, I think it should have been obvious. I told all my friends, he's going to be the next president, because nobody has that level of name recognition and loses. Arnold Schwarzenegger, as a Republican, won in California. That is a perfect explanation of my point. You know what I mean? Republicans win in California, but Arnold Schwarzenegger's the freaking Terminator, man.
Of course. So I agree with everything you're saying there. I guess the question I would have then, and this goes back to, is Donald Trump good for conservatism from a macro view? What has been shown? If you want a conservative to win, you cannot be Ron Paul. I mean from a campaign perspective, from the delivery perspective, you can't be ridiculously educational. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about the folks such as us have a very hard time truly comprehending the reality which the vast majority of Americans, even those who consider themselves conservatives and will vote in favor of conservatism, Republican policy, et cetera, et cetera, they don't actually know what the hell they're voting for. They can't actually have a real dialogue with you in a conversation about it. Now, are there plenty that can? Yes. But I mean, I'm talking about from the macro, again, the macro view, the big picture perspective. I mean, the majority of schools in the United States have not taught basic civics for almost 30 years. I mean, we have to think about this. Like, multiple generations haven't been taught civics. Less than 20% of Americans right now, as of 2020, can even name all three branches of government. So when you think about this in the context of what is constitutionalism, what are your constitutional rights, like all of these different things that we've been discussing, like you have to keep in mind in the back of your head in terms of how these things are approached is most people don't even know what the heck you're talking about, right? And yet as conservatives, we somehow think that we're going to win without pulling punches, or sorry, with pulling punches and, being all, conservative and from a stereotypical perspective, rather than going out and being flashy in the manner that is needed to break through the walls that exist in modern society. And this is why also in my opening statement, I said, is he the traditional quote unquote statesman? No, of course not. But that's the point. In the here and now, he's what we needed. Otherwise, we're dealing with Hillary Clinton and the who knows where we're sitting right now. I mean, you talk about constitutional amendments. There's no telling what level of constitutional liberties would have been decimated, whether it be through the courts, laws, or just refusal to recognize our liberties. I mean, look at what's going on in mostly Democrat states and some Republican states right now. I mean, they're ignoring the Constitution left and right. Judges are refusing to, rule in favor of your constitutional liberties. I mean, like, that's what we're dealing with right now. And, we're on bullseye for conflict. I mean, if Trump loses, who knows where we're going? But that's a sidebar. Continue. Enough of my tangent. Continue.
No, you're fine, man. Absolutely. I go on just as long, if not longer, tangents. But so I there's a couple things I guess I would say. Now, the first thing I do agree with you, obviously, and we see how bad lack of constitutionalism can get, and even on, like you said, Republican state levels. I mean, Brad Little, who's the governor of my state here in Idaho, he's Republican in the same way that the Impossible Whopper is made out of meat. You know what I mean? And it honestly drives me up a wall. Big part of the trying to get him out of here movement, actually, but nonetheless, I agree with a lot of those stuffs. My question would be, now with Ron Paul, there is a little bit of pushback I could give, though I for interest of time, I won't necessarily go too deep into, but I just to briefly say, and you can respond to this and, if you want to, but nonetheless, I would just say, Ron Paul did have age working against him at his most popular. Like, if he could run in 2016 with the popularity he got off of his previous two campaigns, there's a high possibility he could have been, potentially at least nominated. Maybe not elected. I guess we would have been able to see, but at least nominated, right? Also, Ron Paul experienced in 2012 a lot of what Bernie Sanders experienced in 2016, which is that the powers that be sometimes really don't want you to win, even
Agreed.
Trump, to his credit, I will give you this. Trump, to his credit, had so much grassroots support that could not actually have occurred. Like, you could try to swing it in some other guy's favor if you like. It'd be too obvious.
Yeah, and you also have to remember that the establishment, all the way up to Ted Cruz at the Republican National Convention, weren't backing Donald Trump. So your point about Ron Paul, I agree with, and Bernie Sanders, obviously, it's revealed that they rigged the system against Bernie Sanders.
Right.
But I mean, I think you also have to remember that everybody in the Republican establishment, until there was no other option, including Ted Cruz, was against Donald Trump. Continue.
Well, and I would agree with that. Now, in the case of Cruz, I do happen to think he was probably different than in the case of, for example, Kasich.
True.
I think that Cruz genuinely believed, as I do, that Trump is kind of a big city Democrat whose policies I think big city Democrat policies are no longer left-wing enough. Honestly, I think that's what made Trump a conservative. That is my honest theory. I don't think he's a mole or lying. I do think he's a populist because I think he's somewhat of a narcissist, but I'm not going to hold that against him because, to be frank, Richard Nixon and Lyndon B. Johnson and plenty of other presidents were narcissists as well. So I'm not going to necessarily, who cares on that one? That's fine, right? Point being, I will accuse him of being a populist. I will absolutely not accuse him of some of these other things that other people have. But what I would say with the case of Cruz, right? So Cruz has a lot of the same qualities that a lot of people who really support Donald Trump do like. For example, Cruz would call out the media constantly. He doesn't use vulgarity, which does give Trump a little bit of added oomph when he says things sometimes. Like, for example, the whole this isn't a vulgarity thing, but the whole thing with the reporter, right? That's a lot of fans love that. And obviously there's the whole thing. Is he making fun of his disability? Is he not? Do you talk about it for the next 2 months? The thing is, it doesn't matter because Trump did it. Nobody does that. And that obviously makes people talk about him for the next 2 months, right? Cruz isn't going on those levels, but let's recall in the debates 2016, who's the first person to call out the media? It was Ted Cruz, saying, why are you guys saying, oh, Ted Cruz, what's wrong with your hair? Donald Trump, are you a supervillain? You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. That was Cruz. It wasn't Donald Trump. Who was originally proposing ideas like, for example, maybe we should build some kind of a wall. That was actually Ted Cruz, right? And to be fair, people before him as well. I mean,
if you want to go down that rabbit hole, Bill Clinton proposed a wall. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were in favor of walls. Chucky Schumer and Nancy Pelosi voted to fund a wall.
100%.
Way back in 2009. In addressing some of the stuff you're talking about here, this goes back to the ultimate point, though, of the level of hypocrisy in politics is being laid bare by Donald Trump, of just the level of projection on one side. I mean, as a sidebar, the Trump being a narcissist thing, that's leftist propaganda. I dealt with a narcissist, a true one. And when I say dealt with, I won't go into details, but let's just say in business dealings, literally hired a psychologist to figure out what the hell was going on. And so I know a lot about narcissism and narcissism personality disorder and different things that come from it and the way things are approached. Trump is not one. And however, a lot of the traditional politicians, they are 100%. The people calling him one, I'm talking about on both sides, the people that are doing that, they are literally projecting their own underlying problem. And which, by the way, is one of the number one things of a narcissist. They literally mentally believe that what they are doing is what you're doing. And we see this with the left all the time. All these accusations that are made against Trump, and then fast forward, it comes out that the people that were calling him out and accusing him of it were literally doing it. Case in point, Joe Biden. Right? Oh, yeah, Trump needs to be impeached because he did quid pro quo in Ukraine and all this other kind of stuff, right? And then it turns out that, kind of sort of looks beyond doubt. People forget this. Donald Trump last year was impeached.
Right.
We forget about this, right? I watched every minute of the testimony of that in the House, right? I watched some of the stuff, the hearings before the actual impeachment hearings, all that kind of stuff. I'm sitting there listening to this stuff, and I'm like, holy crap. These people are either whining. It's like listening to an HR exit interview of people that are pissed about getting fired, and or people projecting their own underlying corruption. and trying to send it over to beat Trump, right? Same thing with like the Mueller investigation. I mean, all this stuff. It's like, the Crossfire Hurricane thing, right? That's become all the evidence coming out now. Like the FBI and the CIA were actively going after Trump. They were using Russian assets and information to try and go after Trump.
Right.
What was the whole thing Trump was being accused of? Being a Russian asset. Right.
Well, and
I mean, where I'm going with all this, and I think this goes back to the whole "is Trump a conservative" thing. Like, okay, do I think he is everything that we would wish he could possibly be? No. However, when he's being accused of not being any of it, or like in name only as a facade, didn't really mean it, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not saying you're saying that all. I'm talking about like the talking heads, right? It's like, I wonder how much of that is projection. And it seems like on a daily basis, we keep learning things like, oh, I didn't know that his administration was doing this. Oh, I didn't know that they were working on this policy. I didn't know they had tried to do this. I didn't even know that. I mean, it wasn't the headline of one of the cases that some activist judge blocked, right? Because those things just keep coming out. And my point is that I honestly wonder from the macro view again, what we're going to continue to learn that actually lends more and more credence towards Trump actually being much more conservative than we think, and much of what he has done being glossed over by the projection that he's just a big city Democrat and not really actually that conservative. It's all a narcissistic tactic to maintain power.
Well, and so I think there's a lot that I would disagree with on, but there's a point I would agree with on, and it's vital. So I want to kind of narrow in on it for a minute. So when you say that there's a level of exposure that Donald Trump provides, I completely and 100% agree with that. In fact, I would go farther and say that Donald Trump, I think, kind of pulls, the curtains back on the entire country in a way. To get you guys a little bit, and this is I won't go too deep into this because this could derail it, but I do believe that the United States is nearing its end. I believe that Donald Trump is an example of why it needs to near its end. That has been my theory since day one. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. And my question, to kind of let you know, and then I'll reiterate it at the end, is at what cost did we see this nation exposed, right? So Trump, obviously, the ways he exposes the left are obvious, but let's go through them just to remind everybody, right? He is the celebrity president, and yet all of the celebrities hate him. He's a womanizer and somebody who's incredibly sexist, according to Miley Cyrus, who, of course, sexualizes herself on the daily, and Jay-Z, who 99 problems, but a bitch ain't one, and Beyonce, who, of course, is the just female version of Jay-Z, which is somewhat of a literal statement considering the fact that they're married. Numerous porn stars who, of course, have trafficking and all that stuff going on in their area and all this stuff, right? They all hate this man because he's vulgar and he's sexist and he isn't very nice to people and all that other kind of stuff. Hilarious, right? The celebrities hate him because he's a celebrity. Hilarious, right? The billionaires can't stand him even though he's a billionaire, like the Zuckerbergs and the guys who own Alphabet and all that other kind of stuff, right? They don't want this billionaire upperclassman ruling. They want something more akin to a social democracy. And yet, at the same time, they're all billionaire upperclassmen, right? Obviously, there's an exposure there. You have the media talking heads trying to be a resistance, even though they're clearly the establishment. And you have groups like the LGBT movement and Islam being friends with each other, even though that's definitely not the way that the world works in any planet, right? And so on. And obviously, that is a lot of exposed, right? That is some incredible exposed on the left. But you have that same level of exposed on the right. And I think that's even more dangerous because, first off, what happens with the left when they do get exposed is they end up getting rabid, which is what happens to all darkness when it is exposed by light. It gets rabid, right? It gets rabid and it gets evil and it wants to gnarl and gnash and fight back, right? But if you look at what happens when you expose the right, here's what we ended up seeing occur, right? You had people saying, for example, we want some level of decency returns to politics. And so as a result, they elected the most, at least blatantly speaking, indecent man that we've had in politics for quite some time. Now, again, I know people have their background stuff, right? Bill Clinton obviously had stuff that he did in his personal life, but from a blatant perspective, right? Donald Trump is thrice married, has committed adultery at least against his first two wives, and I think it's basically proven at this point his third one as well, because Stormy Daniels would not have been paid off had she not had an affair. Now, granted, her talking about that obviously cost her significant amounts of money, but the fact that the payment existed in the first place is probably indicative of something. Now, should we hold that against Trump? No, obviously, especially as Christians, right? We need to forgive and forget in that sense, right? However, when we're going to say, oh, we're the evangelicals, the moral high horse, we're the ones who are going to try and stop this wave of evil, debauchery, and disgustingness, no free the nipple, no LGBT, all that other kind of stuff, and then we put forward Donald Trump, it's like, okay, so pot, meat, kettle, and nobody's going to take us seriously anymore. I called this the Buttigieg problem because I actually hypothesized that if Pete Buttigieg was the 2020 nomination, that Donald Trump would absolutely lose. And I thought it was because that Donald Trump was, because Buttigieg was such a evangelical, quote unquote, right? That would have made it very difficult for people who find Donald Trump to be mean-hearted, right? It's one thing to be mean, it's another thing to be mean-hearted. People find him to be a genuinely nasty person, right? To be fair, that's the same feeling people get with like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, right? It's not the same feeling people get when they have, like, for example, as much as I don't like him, Barack Obama. Most people didn't find him to be a mean-spirited person, even if they found his policies objectionable and even evil. That means something when you're talking about an electorate and the society as a whole. It doesn't mean anything legitimately, don't get me wrong, but as far as the electorate and society as a whole, it means quite a bit. So Buttigieg, if they would have put him forward, would have been able to say, well, I'm a Christian too, and I don't say any of that stuff, and also I accept homosexuality, and also I do this, and also I do that, and so on and so forth. And the only thing people could throw at him, which Dr. Michael Brown and Dr. James White and Rush Limbaugh and all these other conservatives and Christians did throw at him, is, well, we shouldn't have a homosexual in office because that'll degrade the office. And it's like, really? That'll degrade the office? But thrice married, for multiple philanderings, accusations of rape, which may or may not be true. The point is they exist, right? That doesn't degrade the office. And what it does, if I could just be blunt and stop rambling, what it does is it makes it sound like your morals are kind of convenient to you. Bill Clinton cheating was a problem because Bill Clinton was a Democrat, not because he cheated, right? Pete Buttigieg being gay is a problem, not because he's gay, but because he's a Democrat. Kamala Harris sleeping with somebody, right? So on and so forth. It's what it sounds like. It may not be true per se, but when you put forward, and it's not just Trump, right? Conservatives have now, since Trump, adored Steve, whatever his name is. Although, to be fair, he ended up flip-flopping. So that maybe isn't the best example to use. But Don Blankenship is a good example to use. Steve Bannon is a good example to use, right? The moral defense conservatism provided is I think dead at this point. And I think Trump is sort of, I don't think he's what killed it. I do think he is the example of it being dead. Because frankly, his behavior is, I think you would probably agree. I mean, it's so unnecessary as to be just crude. It degrades the office. It's not like anybody before him was necessarily better, but he now comes out being blatant with it and on the side that claimed moral superiority and actually had it. Because obviously we're not subjectivists, right? The left can claim moral superiority all they want. When you're saying, hey, racism is bad, you filthy white male, you don't get to claim moral superiority, right? On the flip side of that, though, when you're saying, hey, racism is bad, therefore we should have equality for all people, true equality, not, what do they call it? Equity, but equality, that you don't have the objective claim to say you have the moral high ground, right? So on and so forth with that sort of thing. We don't anymore because of Donald Trump and people like him, right? And we've already basically, I wouldn't say we've wholeheartedly agreed because obviously we've had some disagreements here, but we have had a certain level of agreement that Trump is not conservative in the way some guys that might be preferred would be, like a Paul or a Cruz or somebody who's like really ideological. But
what part of, in terms of real world, right? Not ideology, not theoretical, not academic. In terms of the real world, given what we have observed in context of the rabid levels, which you were referring to in relation to the left when the light is exposed. Do you actually think that having the brawler is not what is needed at the moment to win? Not to mix metaphors, not the fencer, but the gladiator. I'll put it in that context. The like, oh, cool, dude, you got your foil, and you've got to go up against, the Rock impersonating the Scorpion King, right? The like, good luck, right?
Right.
And I feel that's part of where I come from in the context, and this goes back into like observation, both in my lifetime and also from historic perspective. Like part of the reason societies get to the position that we're in is there's always this point where wealth and alcohol, drugs, whatever, debauchery reach such an extent that the hoity-toities who are in power give up or give in to corruption by continuing to put forth controllable and malleable pawns, right, in the political sense, and then wonder why everything ends up collapsing. And throughout history, there's been different moments, very few, right? Usually they happen way after the collapse, right? And right. But again, even if it's post-collapse, it's not the fencer who ends up solving the problem. It's the brawler. And that's why I say I always look at Trump as from the historic perspective, is that was what was needed in the moment. And I think that's what a lot of conservatives recognize, is that we've been trying to stop all this stuff, this wave of corruption and debauchery and progressivism that's been, building for the last century, over a century at this point, and wondering why we kept losing, and it's getting, the chances of victory getting fainter and fainter. And then when the brawler rises to the occasion, like I was talking about in my opening statement, then we have conservatives arguing over whether or not he's conservative enough, rather than is he fighting some of the battles, right? And can we agree on that? And what can we do to try and convince him to fight even on a greater level? And instead of fighting internally, what can we do to, like, especially in the context of the second term, like, there is no other option, right?
That is true.
Like, we're at a point, I don't mean to be like cynical on this, but it's like, there is no other option at this point. I mean, Joe Biden is a pawn who's going to get removed from office if he wins. And then we're going to have Kamala Harris be the president. If not, I mean, who knows what might end up going down with the lawyers after the election. But there's actually a realistic proposition that Nancy Pelosi can become the president of the United States. I mean, anyway, enough of my long-winded tangent there. The point I'm making is like we've got I'm talking about from the conservative side. It's like, if we don't start looking at things from a real world perspective, then 10 years from now, we're going to be wondering, assuming Trump wins, right? If we don't change the mindset and start taking action, I'm not real action to win and give no quarter, and none of this like, well, there's not enough of us in this district to win. Like in the city I live in, Nashville, right? I worked very hard twice to help elect a black woman as mayor of Nashville. I looked at the math, and based on the Trump votes, there were enough conservative votes in Nashville to win the mayorship. But the main Republicans in Nashville and Davidson County ended up endorsing the Democrat they thought was slightly less liberal. And they gave money to that person, didn't give money to the candidate I was supporting. And lo and behold, it actually turned out to be further left than the one they were running, the incumbent. Anyway, my point is that a lot of this stuff goes back, and I had to backroom conversations with some of those influential, so quote unquote conservatives. They were the public leaders and all this different stuff. I had the backroom conversations in the mansions and argued to try and convince them to back the woman I was supporting. And literally, it came down to this pragmatic crap, the idealistic, well, both pragmatism, but from a non-optimistic perspective, right? And it's like, at what point do you just admit surrender? And I feel like that's what's been going on, and whether it be surrender in the context of, oh, we must maintain the purest form, otherwise we must, completely abandon, or, well, I don't think we're going to win this one, so let's not do what it takes and put the brawler in and go find the person who's willing to lose and, pull no punches and, go full bore and see if we can somehow expose the insanity. I mean, and this goes back to my earlier point, and I'll shut up, about the ignorance of the average person, right? So I'll use my city again as an example. The Omni Hotel in downtown Nashville literally gets $15 million a year in real cash money check every year from 2016 till 2034. Gets a check. For the first 3 years, it was $12 million. For the rest of it, it's $15 million a year. Just for building their hotel. Like, they literally are going to get more money than it costs them to build the freaking hotel. I mean, you think about this from a corruption perspective. Like, you go to a bank and say, "Hey, bank, hey, we're the Omni. We've got a deal with a city. They're literally going to give us more money than we're asking you for the loan to build it." I mean, think about it. Just use this as an example, right? Like, think about this, right? Fast forward to now. So this happened like 2010. So think about it. Fast forward to now. So a few people have started to like make this public and push it a little bit. Now there's all these people that are pissed off about that kind of deal and some of these other ones and wondering why Nashville is like on the edge of bankruptcy. And this has been public knowledge. Like, I learned it from reading an audit report. It's public knowledge, right? But nobody's done anything about it. So my point is, there are all these conservatives in my market, right? I literally live in the blue county above the reddest county in Tennessee, and actually they've dropped, but they were the reddest county in the entire United States. And yet somehow we've got corruption happening 15 miles north and doing nothing to stop it. And even though there's all these quote unquote conservatives, some of which are very famous conservatives, which live there, and yet somehow things aren't being exposed. And yet then we have somebody like a Trump who doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the traditional conservative. But now the thing that the conservatives wished would happen is happening in terms of that exposure of the corruption. And anyway, enough. I've been running my mouth there for a while, but it's kind of my frustration making sense to you in terms of like the real world pragmatic necessity that is Donald Trump right now, needing to overcome is he the pure conservative?
So let me give kind of an example of why I think, while I agree there needs to be a certain level of bravado brought to the table, absolutely, we need to be very careful as to who we pick to be our brawler. A perfect example, because they happen to be contemporaries of each other, is Napoleon Bonaparte and George Washington, right? Now, both of those men had the qualities that were absolutely necessary in order for the areas in which they lived to actually survive afterwards, right? And a lot of them are even the same qualities. Determination, like a pit bull, right? The kind of like in Valley Forge, you saw it. I will not lose, says George Washington. I don't care if I have no food. I don't care if I have no shoes. I don't care if, like, it literally does not matter. I will not lose, right? In the case of Napoleon Bonaparte, I mean, we literally had to banish the guy twice. And I say we, I mean, obviously America had nothing to do with it, but you know what I mean, right? Dude had to be banished to an island thousands of miles away 2 separate times because he was a pit bull, right? A unifying, charismatic sort of personality, love from his troops, military bravado, and military genius as well, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that are very similar between Washington and Bonaparte, if you think about it, except one was actually, as it turned out, the wrong guy. And he was an emperor, and all things considered, he didn't turn out like some emperors could be, like a Genghis Khan or an Adolf Hitler, but he was at least as bad as an Alexander the Great, right? It was a very problematic situation. On the flip side, George Washington is the 2-term president by choice, who didn't even want to be leader in the first place, who set his nation on the path to be the literal greatest country of all time, right? By the way, there's a much more extreme example of this if you use World War II. Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. Something that historians don't like to admit is Adolf Hitler was, to a very large extent, the hero that Germany needed. He turned the economy around like that. He made the military the strongest army, at least in the world, at least on on paper, right?
Also from a technological innovation perspective, 100%.
Exactly. Winston Churchill did a lot of the same things that were necessary for his country. And Winston Churchill's biggest thing, of course, is I will not back down to Adolf Hitler, right? But one of those men turned out to be the right choice, and one of them didn't, right? And I'm not obviously saying Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not even necessarily saying that he's Napoleon Bonaparte, although I will be honest with you. I don't necessarily think it is outside of the realm of possibility for us to see something akin to like parliamentary monarchy or something like that. Not literally. I don't think there will literally be like the House of Trump or the House of Clinton or anything set up like that. But we're getting dangerously close to a situation where I don't really know what the future will hold. Like, just as an example, let's say 2024, let's say Trump wins 2020, 2024 rolls around and somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or something like that wins, right? I mean, not only is it possible Trump wouldn't give up peacefully, you could make an argument that he shouldn't. You know what I mean? And that is a very dangerous situation for the country to be in. And I personally find that to be inevitable. So with that said, I mean, you know, and I'll even, you know, jump on this too. When you said with 2020, we have no choice. That is true. I agree with that. I will cynically say to you that I believe Republicans and indeed conservatives in 2016 made a bed that cannot possibly be gotten out of. I think the cult of personality mixed with the lack of what we traditionally attributed as conservatism that is present in Donald Trump, as well as his general disregard for what we would consider to be the norms. I think that in and of itself, and combined, by the way, with a couple of other things that are added from Bernie Sanders and have nothing to do with Donald Trump, I think that has gotten us to a point where we will forever be polarized. I don't know if we'll ever have a leader again who isn't like the man in the room. You know what I mean? Like when I say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2024, I think that's possible. And I think it's possible because she would be the woman in the room if she were to be elected, right? Everybody knows her name. She's charismatic. Everybody who loves her, and everybody who hates her wants her dead. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like, and that's the same thing.
I'll go with her. I don't know if when she finally is actually old enough, I don't know if she'll be able to get away with being dumb. I mean, because like, if you, I mean, I'm sure you have it. I mean, for those who haven't, if you actually listen to her talk,
yeah,
and make her like, she's dumb.
Yeah,
she's real dumb. I mean, the fact that she has supposedly has a degree in economics and international business, that woman is dumb.
Hey,
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, she's clearly the actor, not the brain. But she's not the screenwriter. Like, she's the actress, and it's obvious. But I mean, I don't disagree with you in the context of she may have the name recognition and such. But I think also, I'm saying this to myself to kind of like a we might be able to stop her. Is people will, at least theoretically, would be able to recognize that woman is dumb. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, you know, Stalin wasn't necessarily an intelligent person, but he was shrewd and he knew how to get in power, right? And that obviously, you know, that was good enough. And I think, honestly, at this point, I think we are going to hit a point in time when, and I'll just give an example. So if you were to put forward something like Kamala Harris, and by the way, this doesn't even necessarily have to be a moral claim. You can put forward the moral claim if you like, saying how, you know, egregious it is to literally sleep with a married man in order to be, you know, a district attorney. But let's just take it from the purely pragmatic corruption standpoint, right? You put that forward, since it's tied to an adultery, that person will always have the ability to turn that back around on you and say, yeah, but you're wearing a MAGA hat, and Trump with his first wife and his second wife and his third wife. How do you respond to that without appealing to ideology? And the reason I say without appealing to ideology is because when you appeal the ideology, what it now sounds like is those things are wrong when
Well,
you're
I
not when
mean,
my guy does it.
from
What I mean?
no, see, from a moral, like, do I agree with what he did? No. However, the key distinction I think you're missing is, um, did Trump banging playmates and models and everything else have anything to do with what he was doing in business, whether or not he succeeded or failed?
Well, and I guess in that example, you couldn't necessarily use Kamala, but you could use Buttigieg and you could use Bill Clinton also. I mean, Bill Clinton, getting head in the Oval Office didn't affect what he did as president. Let's just be 100% honest about that, right? Like that.
Right. But what I'm saying is, at any point when all this stuff that you're talking about, and what I'm about to say applies to Clinton and all this other stuff, was Donald Trump a public servant elected official?
No, and that's a fair point. I'll grant you
So
that.
was he present in the time when all that was going down? Was he presenting himself as this, pinnacle of moral credibility and all those other things that you should just, trust everything he says because, he's this upstanding member of society from, all these different perspectives. You should vote for me. No, in no way, shape, form, or fashion. I mean, good Lord, like what, 2007, 2008, whatever it was, he goes and does he did the WWE thing with McMahon.
Right.
I mean, he was not planning on running for president, right? He had no intention of he talked about back in like 88 or whatever it was, and well, I might do it, but he wasn't actually thinking he was going to do it, right? Oh, I'd love to, but no. I mean, heck, in 2012, I wanted him to run back in 2012, and because I knew that Romney was a joke, and Trump was the kind of person that we needed now, right? And because of the corruption, because of the degradation of society, it wasn't that Trump was the ideal statesman. No, he's the pragmatic solution. And it's the same thing in business, in every other aspect of society, of real world society. There's the ideal, and then there's reality, and what actually has to be in place. For example, you want something welded, right? You want you need a machine shop to build you something custom. Yeah, you can design it all day long and do the sketches and such, but it's not going to turn into reality unless you have the guy who knows how to get the welding machine ready and get all the helium and different things to make sure you have the right wire type, all that stuff till down to the moment where the heat the welding machine turns on, and now you're literally bonding two pieces of steel, right? It's a totally different dynamic in terms of the real world, not the academic, not the theoretical, not the ideology, but the real world. And I think that's what, and this is a quick sidebar, and we probably need to wrap up and let people get some questions in and then call it a night. I know I got to work tomorrow and get things done, but I know you've been working all day too.
Yeah.
I guess the point I'm making is, in my experience in business, right? There's the academics that come up with all those different theories. And then there's the entrepreneur that goes out and does it. Right. And I can tell you from having had many interactions with very successful individuals back in my previous life, some of the richest, most successful people I know are some of the most crass, least refined that you will ever come across. But when it comes to business, understanding people, getting stuff done, negotiations, all that kind of stuff, it's a whole nother world. They flip the switch when they walk. One of my gentlemen, I won't say his name, he's very wealthy. Okay. Very wealthy. Made his money in all sorts of crazy ways. Anyway, long story. He drinks on one of his many golf courses, ironically. What's rich guys owning golf courses? Weird. They gets hammered at his country club all the time. And then in a drunken stupor can turn on a switch. And now he's in full scale business mode. It's amazing. But again, you met him on the street, you'd think he was some country bumpkin, right? But business-wise, the dude is stupidly successful. And the point I'm making is in the context of the person you want at your church Sunday school service is totally different. Now, they might be able to be one and the same, potentially, but is way different than the person you want, like, going up against a union, right? And all the bosses of that stuff who are threatening them and all this kind of stuff. It's a totally different dynamic. And anyway, enough of my tangent there. That kind of stuff, I think, is just the things that conservatives have to keep in mind in the context of the Trump and the future, right? Of what actually is going to work. And could we potentially reach the point where the purely academic and theoretical and the ideology, the pinnacle of the ideology can be real in terms of the person that embodies it, right? Mm-hmm. In a position of power? Hopefully. But I would say from a historic perspective, the probability of that is low. And we have to look at things from a pragmatic but optimistic perspective. That's my last word there. Go ahead, man.
Well, and so I guess as sort of my last word, what I would say is I think there is a lot to be said for, accuracy in trying to get somebody in there, even if you can't necessarily get the best guy in there. Just as an example, when it comes to the pro-life issue, right, Trump had the Title IX, funding reduced, so that something like 900 abortion clinics lost what amounted to about $284 million in federal funding. Very nice. Like that. In the end, when you're killing 900,000 babies a year, I think it ends up being not worth very much. And I think that is what I think creates a reason why I consider Trump to be at least neutral for conservatism, is that in the end, nothing gets, like, the debt goes up, the wars still continue, the government gets larger, our rights get eroded, and nothing necessarily changes. But, and this is kind of what I was saying there at the end, I would say that what is added with Trump is the double-edged sword of exposure of our elite, right? The corporatists and the people who run Hollywood and the people in Washington. But that's both sides. And to a certain extent, it exposes our populace also. And I think it gets rid of that defense that we as conservatives once provided for. Hey, we do support the Constitution. We do support things like low budget. And most importantly, in that regard, we do support the idea of being, decent, not just necessarily, because it's one thing. I would honestly be completely frank with you. The way Donald Trump treats people and, like, being vulgar and stuff like that, that's actually the lowest of his decency problems, in my personal opinion, because I can deal with that all day. The bigger ones for me are things like, for example, the thrice married. I personally cannot explain to a Democrat who puts forward Buttigieg, right, or somebody like him. I don't know what to tell that person when they say, why is it okay for Trump to be thrice married serial philanderer, but not for Buttigieg to be in a monogamous homosexual relationship, politically speaking, just strictly from because I can tell them religiously speaking why I think both are wrong, of course, right? But from a political standpoint, why is this one guy on the right okay, but this guy on the left wrong? Anything I give him honestly ends up sounding like ideology to me, and I think people will see through that. I think,
I mean, with Buttigieg, though, I disagree with his policies.
Right. So that might be true for you. And to be fair, I commend you if that is the big thing you use against him, because frankly, I can't take Trump supporters seriously when they have problems with Buttigieg's lifestyle. I do actually have genuine problems with Buttigieg's lifestyle, and I wouldn't vote for him as a result. But the same is true for Trump as well. So,
but here's the thing with conservatives, oftentimes they get, and I think this applies to the pro-life versus pro-choice. It's happening on both. It's being leveraged on both sides of the equation, right? All the identity politics issues are leveraged to convince people that if on insert identity politics issue, whatever, this person does not agree with you 100%, even if you agree with them on 99 other things, you can't vote for them. And even though it's like, when it comes down, I'm talking about in terms of general elections. Okay. It's like, okay, so the person over here on the other option, they also disagree with you on this position and 99 others.
Right.
But you won't go be a pragmatist and vote for this other person. and give them a chance to win, and then, and I'm not saying you, I'm used rhetorically, and then you wonder why everything's being pushed to the left. And I'm like, in what world, fantasy land, do you live in that you think that any other logical outcome is going to happen? Like any other outcome is going to be the logical conclusion. Like, where do you live in? Like, what fantasy bizarro world do they? I'm talking about the hardcores that just like, I can't do it for insert whatever reason.
Yeah, like the Lincoln Project guys.
Yeah, I'm like, what are you talking about? You guys are idiots. And and then we wonder how totalitarians take over. Like, the whole premise of identity politics has been leveraged for a long time, right? Not just in modern society; it's been leveraged throughout history. Not to the extent necessarily as what's going on in modern United States politics. Like, it's happening to such a degree that it's mind bending. But I mean, as a quick sidebar, I'm going to wrap up. Hey, folks. Anyway, if you have some questions you want to ask, we're going to probably do it for like 15 minutes and or however long we get them. Tag me so I know it's an actual question. But Trudeau's super nice. Do you want him as the president of the United States if he was an American?
Well, and that is a fair point for sure, right? Like, there is a double-edged sword here as well, where, you know, you can't just be. In fact, I'll give an even better example for you. Jimmy Carter is like an ideal Christian. You know what I mean? Like, in his personal life. Yep. But Jimmy Carter is a hellacious politician that I would not be caught dead voting for, right? There's no way. So I hear you loud and clear there for sure.
Let's use that as an example. Donald Trump versus Jimmy Carter. Who are you voting for?
Yeah, I mean, if you had to
vote, who you voting for? Jimmy Carter or Donald Trump?
Yeah, you'd have to go for Trump. Honestly, like, if you absolutely had to vote between those two people, I would.
Okay, so how do you think evangelicals voted for Trump?
But I think the difference there lies in
no. Hillary Clinton was not a Christian, right?
Right.
By any stretch of the imagination, she's against religious freedom in many ways. But as a staunch conservative, if you had to choose between Donald Trump and the upstanding Christian Jimmy Carter, who would you vote for?
Well, to be fair, though, I do have to. There's a little bit of context that I would personally add, because I agree with you. There's a solid point there to be made. The thing that I would say in return, though, is that we, as the voting populace, not only have the ability to create that third option, which, to be fair, sometimes doesn't exist, right? You need a good third party in order to put forward a good third party. But on top of that, though, in these primary elections, which are, I mean, they're near forgotten. Just to give an example, the guy who won the Republican Party nomination for 2018 governor of Idaho won something like 70 million votes. And when he actually won governor of Idaho, it was like 250 million votes. The point being that a whole lot of people decided that we're not going to pay attention to the primary, right? And what I would say is, we as a society, if there's any hope for us at all, we need to make sure we don't get to Donald Trump versus Jimmy Carter. Because at that point, you're right. There is there is a very serious problem on one side that is impossible to ignore. And so you're forced into a corner. But wouldn't it be so much better if it was Ron Paul versus Jimmy Carter? Or even if it was Mike Huckabee versus Jimmy Carter, who, to be fair, is wishy-washy on some things, but the things even he's wishy-washy on, they're honest. Like, for example, he refuses to cut Social Security, but it's because that money's already been taken and he feels like it's theft. It's like, I'm like, that's not very conservative of you, but at least it's coming from a place of genuine honesty. You know what I mean? There's something admirable about it. And I don't know. I guess I would just say.
Well, the reason I was bringing that up was one of the points you made earlier was about how do you defend, as a conservative, as an evangelical, etc. How do you defend voting for Trump? And that's why I'm making the point of,
okay,
would you vote for Trump or Jimmy Carter? In this context, Jimmy Carter is actually a Christian, unlike Hillary Clinton, right? And which is why I say, in the context of pragmatism, of like, okay, I'm either going to support Donald Trump So I can either, and I think part of the reason that, like, for example, I think a big portion of it as well as a sidebar is the underlying issue is that one of the other reasons that Romney lost was evangelicals didn't turn out to vote for the Mormon.
Right.
And that's a fact.
That's
right?
definitely a fact for sure. It's
So
the same
it's
thing
like-
happened for Catholics.
So then we have a, self-perpetuated problem, right? We instead of looking at politics from a principled perspective, but also a pragmatic one, right? Of like, oh, we've been doing this principled voting, either voting on principle or not voting.
Right.
I mean, the voter turnout in the United States is a joke. It's an absolute joke. And then we wonder how this crap happens. I mean, for example, almost every election, I'm not necessarily presidential always, but like the local elections or statewide elections are usually decided by 1% to 3%. It's like, okay, let's think about this and how the incumbents have such ridiculously high probabilities of reelection, right? It's I only have to bullshit and convince 1% to 3% at the high end, maybe 5% of the people who are going to vote that I'm not full of crap. Like, that's it. And then on top of that, I literally only have to maintain this facade for like 2 to 3 weeks before the election day. And I have name recognition and I have incumbency. I get reelected. And if I'm a senator, I don't have to come back for 6 years. I'm going to do whatever the heck I want to do. And they do it. I mean, because one of the things I always try to relay to people is like, you have to think about this from like a real world perspective, right? So let's think about this. Let's say you got hired for a job and you knew that no matter what you did, you had a 96% probability or 96% probability that no matter what you did, you would not get fired. I mean, what would you do? You wouldn't show up to work. Oh, wait, that's politicians. You wouldn't, you do the exact opposite of what you were told to do. You would violate all of the terms of your employment contract. Right. And it's like, well, what do politicians do? They do exactly that. And then they get reelected. And then they do it even worse. I mean, and I say all this in context of like Joe Biden, right? The stuff that's coming out about what Biden was doing are the literal embodiment of what I'm saying right now. It escalates over him using politics for 47 years. And like all this stuff hit the pinnacle while he was vice president. It was going on before. And we know this because like Hunter Biden was getting 100K contracts and all this kind of stuff to literally not do anything. While his daddy was pushing legislation through that benefited the companies that were lobbying for it in Washington who were paying his son.
Right.
I mean, like, let's think about this. Like, okay, and then you fast forward to him being the vice president of the United States, and now his brother is getting $1.5 billion contracts for building houses. He's never built a house in his life, and the company gets the contract, $1.5 billion, to build houses in Iraq. Like, what? I mean, this stuff is just mind-bending, right, of what's going down. And anyway, all right, so before we'll go off on that, we can talk about this kind of stuff all night. And the irony for folks, as we kind of wrap up and go into Q&A, is while CJ and I obviously disagree on some aspects of this whole conversation, we also agree on a lot of things. And in principle, I agree with what he's saying. I think I'm just a little bit older and I have more cynicism, I think, which is ironic because he is the cynic. Anyway, okay, so we have, let's see, Utopia Buster. All right, CJ, this is a question for you. I'm gonna put it up on screen too. Oops. How do we achieve this conservative utopia?
Well, true utopia is not possible. I would say, if you're asking me this genuinely, and I'm not being, attempting to be secular or anything like that, I would honestly say there is no way for a society to get even close to ideal without the literal hand of God. So pray, vote is secondary to that, is my honest, and I mean genuine prayer, because here's the thing, this isn't a prosperity gospel, right? Where it's like, oh, we're all going to get together and sing Kumbaya with the Lord, and then we're going to have lots of prosperity, yay! Right? That's not how it works. We need genuine repentance. I think that's the huge deal of it. Now, strictly politically speaking, dropping the religious thing for a moment, I would say the closest we could get is some level of, I think, wrecking ball as president could at least get us relatively close. Because right now, society as a whole does not agree with conservatism, and therefore it makes it very difficult. There's a reason that Trump lost the popular vote in that sense, right? It's because liberalism is the predominant worldview at the moment. But if you got somebody, for example, like a Ron Paul or a Ted Cruz, or somebody who was willing to take that pen, sign 8, 9, 10 executive orders, just obliterating certain groups, like the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms doesn't exist anymore. It was signed in with an executive order. We signed it out with an executive order. This war, we're not in it anymore. We signed it. We can sign out of it, right? If you had somebody who was willing to do that, which, to be fair, could potentially cost them their lives, because there are people who are very high up who do not want this sort of stuff to occur. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just the way that life is, right? If we had somebody who was willing to do that, I think we could get close. We could start to pay off some of our debts. We could get a lot of our troops home. We could make sure that there's a certain level of accountability in government, and maybe return some of our freedoms. Maybe make it a little bit, more difficult for the government to stockpile all your text messages and stuff like that. As Edward Snowden revealed 2014, you know what I mean? So actual utopia, not possible. But I think really, I think a very solid wrecking ball could do a lot of damage that would at least get us on the right path.
I would agree with that. The only thing I would insert into that would be, if you look at things from the last 100 years, Trump's actually bringing those troops home. So that's one aspect of it. Okay, the one, the only stupid whore energy has a question for me. This goes along with the. Oh, oops, that is not going on. She's. Okay. Are you aware that Trump was treated by antibodies tested on decades-old aborted fetuses? I've heard some talking points about that. I'm assuming all of this was, obviously it was decades old, so it's in vitro. What the private company tested something on, president will have control over that. Whether should he have taken it, I don't know. I don't know. That's a catch-22 question, I guess. All right, let's see. Brady. To get this is for you, CJ. To get the candidate you are talking about would take a miracle. Trump is the one you are looking for, bro.
Well, so I'll address that in two parts. So the first one, to get to would take a miracle. Potentially that's true. Maybe it is that the hearts of the world need to be changed before the minds, and that's sort of the little tiny religious rant I went on a little bit earlier, I guess. That said, I do think, as I kind of pointed out, there has been some guys who have run in the past who I personally would trust, although of course nobody's perfect. I am personally on the Cruz 2024 train. I hope he runs again. If he's serious about his convictions, he will not be running for Senate in 2024 because he says he agrees with 12-year term limits. So we'll see about that. Obviously, an immediate political opportunity there would then, of course, be to run for president. So it's not without, outside of the realm of possibility. But honestly, even Mike Pence is not as he's not Ron Paulian by any stretch of the imagination. But Mike Pence is somebody who I think is conservative enough, especially in light of Bush, Paul Ryan, McConnell, even Trump, that I would be impressed with the Republican Party putting him forward as the actual nomination. Now, is that actually going to happen? Maybe not. Maybe it is that is a dying breed at this point. I guess they do call it traditionalist conservatism, so maybe traditions just die hard, right? Now, as to the second part, Trump is the one you're looking for. I will agree there are things about Trump I appreciate. His calling out the media, his willingness to be sort of a pit bull against people like the upper echelons of corporations and established politicians in both parties. However, I think in the end, the things that I am truly looking for still continue. We're still in the forever wars. The government still grows. They still spy on me. They still want my liberties. There's still, not to sound too much like this is the most bleeding heart liberal I'll ever get, I promise you. But they are still using my money to bomb brown kids in the Middle East who did not have anything to do with 9/11. You know what I mean? Like, that's still occurring. We're still murdering 900,000 in the womb. We still got $900 billion in deficit. I personally think these issues are so great that it almost becomes a moot point sometimes when certain things are accomplished. Like, oh, we did get the Mexico City policy back, yeah, but are we still using at least $1 billion to fund 900,000 killed babies a year? Then I don't think it matters. And perhaps I am an ideologue. I am 22, so we'll see about that. But I guess that's my point there with the second point there, Brady.
Well, there's nothing wrong with being an ideologue and an optimist. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Yeah, without it, nothing ultimately gets changed. You get older, you get more cynical and more. So many people just refuse to. It's an aspect of age and responsibility, in a large part, but people get less and less willing to take the risk and the gamble to make change, and they forget what it was like when they were young, the willingness to take risk, and the fact that, oh well, I guess my little life might get shattered. And that's part of the reason that in terms of Trump, when I say, I'm talking about his opening statement, but of the man who had more to lose rose to the occasion. And when you look at it, he's lost a lot of money. It's like he had personal risk, and not only for himself, but also for his family, and could have gone off and played golf into his 80s, right? They had a good time. Now, if he loses in November, they're probably going to try and press charges on him for who knows what, or at least destroy him and make him go bankrupt. I mean, it's and I say all this just in context of some of these other folks that we're talking about, the Cruzes and such of the world. It's like, yeah, I hope that Cruz doesn't run in 2024 and backs up his stuff, because so many of the politicians, and even the supposedly quote unquote conservative ones who claim to respect term limits and such, yeah, that was 30 years ago.
Right.
And they're still in office. Right. It's I think that's where some of the cynicism comes from, of like, you ran on this was your campaign promise. And anyway, it's kind of crazy. But and by the way, Utopia Buster says it's not a question, but going with Governor Noam from South Dakota in 2024, I agree with that. And as a sidebar, by the way, from earlier tonight, if the Democrats hadn't lost their minds, oh crap, it's late. Having a brain freeze. What's her name? The only moderately sane of the candidates during the primaries on the Dem side. From Hawaii.
Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tulsi Gabbard could have beat Trump.
Oh yeah, definitely. She could have. Absolutely.
When I was watching those debates, and I'm like, why are they against Tulsi Gabbard? She is the one that will beat Trump. Like, she will beat Trump. I mean, I was scared. I'm watching. I'm like, oh crap! Please don't let her win. Please don't let her win. Like, this is a serious problem. And nope, the Democrat establishment is that dumb.
Well, you know who one of the worst one was? Just briefly, you remember Howard Schultz saying he was going to run as an independent?
Yep.
Howard Schultz is moderate enough that a lot of people who think like me could vote for him. And that, honestly, I was surprised when Democrats attacked him, because it was one of those things where it was like, this guy honestly legitimately could defeat. Like, he was concerned enough with things like for example, the budget and getting people out of conflict in the Middle East. You know what I mean? That like it really would have been possible, but they shunned him. And as a result, he didn't even end up running. And so it is true. I mean, the Democratic establishment and really the establishment in both parties is just brain dead. Yep. And so out of touch with
they live in the DC bubble, the New York bubble, which is not reality. It really is kind of fascinating to interact with, like with Nashville growing so much. There's always people that are moving down here from Chicago, New York, Boston, LA. And it's very interesting interacting with a lot of these folks when they come here, and it's like, huh, man, it turns out the rest of the world is like doesn't think like us, referring to their bubbles, right?
Right.
And the I think for New York, the ultimate irony for me is like they think that because they're hyper densely populated and overrun with angry people, that is the rest of the world, when they are actually the outlier, not the commonality. And it's so ironic. And then they wonder why they can't somehow, transfer their ideology to and I think, as a sidebar to extent in terms of our conversation tonight, I think to an extent some of the activist conservatives that went to Washington to lobby, I think many of them have also fallen prey, not necessarily from a corruption perspective, but from just the fog, the cognitive fog that is so dense across DC. And I think there is some of that to an extent. And because you see it with some of them, even when they like leave and they go like they're interviewed when they're on a campaign tour, for example, and you can see it. They even talk about it sometimes, like of just how different it is. I'd forgotten how differently people think, and it's like, yeah, all you've done for the last decade is lobby and deal with the insanity and the corruption that is Washington. And I think just as a human, I think it's very easy to forget what it's like in the rest of the world. But
Raul Labrador actually said that he's a representative, former representative from here in Idaho. He actually had something to say about that, talking about how coming back home was really weird, because of the fog. And actually, he ended up kind of cynically concluding that he did not actually think Congress could be saved. But nonetheless, you get the idea that it can definitely, I feel you, wear and tear on even people who are ideologically pure, if you will.
Well, at some point, either we will have collapse or Washington will have to be cleaned up. Like, there's no way around it. Or we'll have to have collapse and then clean up. I mean, right. There's no other way that's going to happen at this point. It's so entrenched that I'm optimistic that if Trump gets reelected, he will be able to operate as more of the bulldog that you were talking about earlier. Obviously that usually happens in the context of second term presidents anyway, right? But I think if he gets reelected, I think he may be much more aggressive. But I think one of the points you made earlier, I think this needs to be discussed, is some of the court rulings that have completely and utterly overturned the established precedent of, hey, another president can undo an executive order. The fact that there were different courts, and I know some in the Supreme Court and overruled, but the Supreme Court with DACA, for example, Roberts ruled with the lower court that it's like, what? Obama issued an executive order. Trump issued another one to undo it. And then it goes all the Supreme Court, and they ruled that the current president can't undo the executive order of a previous president. What? I think to an extent, so that's one of those other little things that has to be considered in the context of like what kind of roadblocks has Trump been facing in many aspects of, like, you wouldn't think that the Supreme Court would rule that, right?
Well,
you have literally since the ratification of the United States Constitution until this or 2019, no court had ever ruled that the current president cannot undo an executive order of a previous president. Like, that had never been supported ever. That one really blows my mind. But anyway, all right, folks, we've been going on this for a while. I've really enjoyed it. Do you have any final words? And we'll wrap up. I haven't seen any more questions. I think everybody's doing a little too much trash talking, and we're trash talking each other inside chat instead of giving us and our giant egos and our verbose minds opportunity to talk more. But I guess we're not important enough. So wrap up, man. I want to say thank you very much for coming on and doing this. It was a great idea. I really enjoyed it. Had fun. Hope we'll do some more of these different topics in the future. And Yeah, man. Floor is yours. Wrap up, and let's do this again soon. Oh, CJ is frozen. Oh man. We lost him. All right. Well, on that note, I guess we will call it a night. Thanks so much, CJ. Hey, for folks who are watching this, the link to his channel is in the description. Description. Go check him out. Make sure you sub. And as you consider whether things about your existence, how we're here, what you should do politically, things about the country, history, politics, existence, all those different things, make sure that the conclusions you reach and the analysis you give and the ultimate conclusions that you support are the logical, plausible, and probable ones. And let's keep America great again. Let's be forward thinking, and let's have a great night. And hope everybody has a great week. And thanks for tuning in.